speak of the age of Jackson, I'm not just referring to the years in which Andrew Jackson was the president. I'm talking about the 1820s through the 1840s, a fairly long period of time where I think there's some trends developing. I first want to spend some time talking about these long-term trends, and then we'll look at some specific incidents to occur during Jackson's day. First of all, let's think about industrialization. This time period in America was a time of rapid industrialization. There was a consumer revolution fueling rapid industrialization and rapid growth in factory production. We should consider some of the early factories in America and how conditions rapidly deteriorated. If you look at the Lowell system in Massachusetts, early on this seemed to be the ideal factory situation. It provided employment for single young ladies from New England who wanted to get a job outside the home, earn some money to send back home to their families. And they lived in dormitory type housing. They were well fed, well dressed, treated fairly well. They had leisure time and they put together their own newspaper. But then as time went on, competition changed their situation. As more and more factories competed with each other, there was the speed up demanding that labor be done faster, and conditions deteriorated along with wages. What did this mean for those original employees? They could stand together and speak out against the changes, but this was ineffective because there was a long line of immigrants waiting to replace them. Immigrants leaving Europe who were happy to find work in America in spite of the speed up and the wage cuts and so on. Going hand in hand with this industrialization was also a cotton revolution and a revolution in transportation. After the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, it was possible to produce and process much more cotton than ever before, and this was being sent to the industrialized Northeast, where cotton was turned into textiles that could be marketed. Transportation advancements included not only railroads, which were beginning to spread across America, but also water transportation with the invention of the steamboat and building canals like the famous Erie Canal. A national road was also built. Besides industrialization, another important theme of the Age of Jackson is democratization. Democratization. By that I mean the process of extending power to the people and the belief that common men could be trusted to make decisions. This is at first apparent in the area of politics. What evidence do we see for political democratization? Well, before this time, voting requirements in the United States were so that only certain people could vote. Obviously, the American Revolution did not result in women's suffrage, but there wasn't even universal white manhood suffrage. Okay, even if a person were a white male in America, he still had to often meet property requirements before he would be allowed to vote. By the age of Jackson, it had begun changing, state by state. These property requirements were dropped, and we can't credit Andrew Jackson with bringing about this change. The opposite is the case. This democratization made it possible for someone like Andrew Jackson to rise up in the political world because he was voted in by this new class of the common man voting. Not only were more people than ever before eligible to vote, but they were taking advantage of the right to vote. For example, in 1824, 27% of eligible voters showed up at the polls. fairly low number. But by 1840, 78% of eligible voters were participating in politics. So there was not only an extension of who could participate in politics, but there was much enthusiasm. People were taking advantage of that opportunity. In a way, that's good that more people were actively involved in their government, but it also created an atmosphere of political corruption. The campaigning style that developed during the age of Jackson was not just campaigning by promising voters what they wanted, but basically selling votes. Very often, candidates would treat potential voters to alcoholic beverages and outright vote buying. There was a lot of corruption, and the spoils system was also rampant. Many candidates believed that if they were elected to office, that gave them the right to share the spoils of victory with their supporters. For example, assign good jobs, good government jobs, to supporters who probably weren't the most qualified. But the spirit of democratization was so widespread that it extended beyond politics into the realm of religion as well. In the first few decades of the 1800s, the Second Great Awakening spread throughout America. It was similar to the First Awakening in that it was a period of widespread revivalism, but it popularized an important theological shift away from Calvinism towards Arminianism. Prior to this time, many Christians accepted the doctrine of election and predestination, believing the Bible teaches that man in his natural state is spiritually dead and unable to do anything to save himself, not even to repent of his sin or trust in Jesus for salvation. They believed in the necessity of a new birth, by the grace of God alone, to change a man's heart. But during the Second Great Awakening, it became more popular to teach that man had a free will, that God was trying to save everyone, and that an individual had to choose to cooperate with him. The famous evangelist Charles Finney preached a sermon called Sinners Bound to Change Their Own Hearts, where he alluded to the democratization of his day by comparing the followers of God and Satan to political parties. He said, "Sinner, instead of waiting and praying for God to change your heart, you should at once summon up your powers, put forth the effort, and change the governing preference of your mind." Finney was known for implementing what was known as new measures to urge people to make this decision. He introduced practices such as altar calls and the anxious bench, which have become so commonplace in many churches that many people consider it typical of old-time religion. The fact, however, is that this was a controversial innovation in the early 1800s. Now let's turn to Andrew Jackson himself. Jackson had a reputation for being a common man's man. He appealed, as I said before, to this new class of voters by projecting the image that he was one of them. Andrew Jackson was born in poverty. He didn't have the best education, although he did become a frontier lawyer. He had rough manners, much like many of the common man of America. He had a reputation as a war hero, partly as an Indian fighter and also from his victory at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. He was known for a violent temper and a strong sense of honor, and very often he was found defending honor with a duel. Let me give you an example. His wife, Rachel Robards. In some states, like South Carolina, divorce was still illegal in the 1800s. In others, individual divorces had only been granted occasionally by special acts of the legislatures. Church and state both discouraged the practice. Many churches taught that because marriage was for life, divorce and remarriage was adultery, and churches often excommunicated offending members. During the age of Jackson, some churches and states were becoming more accommodating of divorce, but it was still difficult to obtain, and it took quite some time to go through the legalities after divorce cases were moved from state legislatures to the court system. Andrew Jackson married Rachel Robards while she was still legally married to her first husband. and talk of their controversial relationship haunted them as he rose in Tennessee politics. Jackson fought 13 duels, often over his wife's honor, and he even killed one man. When Rachel died of a heart attack soon after he was elected president, he blamed political opponents for publicizing the scandal. In some ways, Jackson wasn't what you would call a common man. He became a successful planter and lawyer, as we've said before. He owned slaves. He was fairly well-to-do towards the end of his life. And obviously he was elected president of the United States. There's nothing common about that. But as he rose up in life, you could say he never forgot his roots or got above his raising. He continued to use the same mannerisms that made him fit in with the common man of his day. This is evident if you look at his inauguration. I like to call it the Shindig of 1829. Typically, when you think of an inaugural ball, you think of a fairly dignified event where only an elite few are invited to attend. It's fairly orderly, but this was not the case when Andrew Jackson was inaugurated president. He welcomed the common man of America to celebrate his inauguration in Washington, D.C. As you might imagine, to the common man who in many ways had not fit inside the Washington circle before, this was a great development. But to the old Washington elite, this was alarming. A chaotic country brawl come to the White House. What is the country coming to? Now let's consider 3 major events from during Jackson's presidency. First of all, the Bank War of 1832. You should remember the discussion earlier of a national bank that Alexander Hamilton had supported and Congress implemented, but this bank was only chartered for a number of years, and then when the charter was up, it would have to be renewed or the bank would die. Well, the National Bank's 20-year charter was going to expire in 1836, but in 1832, Henry Clay thought it would be a good idea to try to pass a recharter bill early. What was he thinking? Well, Henry Clay made a miscalculation. I'll tell you what he was right about and what he was wrong about. Henry Clay wanted to make an election year issue out of the National Bank. He believed that he would be successful in getting a recharter bill to pass Congress, and he was right about that. He also predicted that Andrew Jackson would veto the bill because he hated the National Bank. Clay was right about that too. He expected that this would turn into a propaganda war where he and Jackson, opponents of the bank and supporters of the bank, would try to convince the American public that their sides were right. This is where he was wrong. He thought he would win that political battle. In the end, Americans sided with Jackson against the bank, and it backfired. But in this propaganda war, on the one hand, supporters of the bank talked about King Andrew, comparing Andrew Jackson to a tyrant, because with his veto power, they claimed he was standing in the way of the will of the people, which Congress was speaking for. On the other hand, opponents of the bank talked about the monster bank, this big corrupt institution that was benefiting an elite few and taking advantage of the common man. Well, after winning this bank war, Andrew Jackson wasn't content to stop there. Remember, he had a violent temper and a sense of revenge. He wanted to destroy the National Bank before its time. In order to do so, he took all the federal funds out of the National Bank, and that was a big chunk of the money that they had, and placed it in pet banks within the states, smaller banks, that had some pretty speculative, loose practices. You know, paper money is only worth something if it's backed up by something of real worth. And if a bank just prints paper money like there's no tomorrow, there's going to be rapid inflation. And this is what happened with these pet banks. This move resulted in some economic panics, which were especially severe in 1837 and 1839. So Andrew Jackson was able to convince the common man, American, that the national bank was against his best interests. But when you look at the economic problems of the day, you have to ask yourself who came out on the short end of the stick. This was definitely a severe blow to the common man of America. Let's also consider the nullification crisis of 1832. I mentioned before that a tariff of abominations had been passed in the late 20s, and this created a lot of opposition, especially in South Carolina, where John C. Calhoun was an outspoken opponent of the tariff. Well, in 1832, yet another new high tariff was passed, and this time the state of South Carolina was prepared to take official action. They nullified the tariff. Well, this creates a situation for a showdown of authority between the federal government and the state government. How would you expect Andrew Jackson to respond? On the one hand, he was born a Southerner and no doubt could relate to how Southerners resented the tariff. But don't forget, he was the President of the United States at this time. He was the chief executive of the United States, and it was his duty to enforce the laws of the federal government. So Jackson responded to nullification with a threat in the Force Act. He threatened to use force if necessary to make sure that South Carolina abode by the federal law. This looks like potential for a civil war, doesn't it, already in the 1830s, over a tariff. As it turned out, however, Henry Clay, the great compromiser from Kentucky, worked out yet another compromise. South Carolina agreed to back down, go back on nullification, in exchange for making the tariff easier to live with. The tariff would gradually be lowered over time. Sort of like the Missouri Compromise, this nullification compromise put off the crisis for a while, but it didn't settle the issue. We'll see more about nullification and then secession later on in the course. Finally, let's talk about Cherokee removal. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act with the intention of signing treaties with individual Indian tribes where they would agree to relocate to the West. I want to focus on the story of the relocation of the Cherokee Nation. First, let's just talk about the Cherokee Nation itself. The Cherokee Nation occupied quite a bit of territory in the American South. The heart of the Cherokee Nation was in northern Georgia with their capital of New Echota. But the Cherokee Nation took up parts of Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, parts of several states. The Cherokee Nation was surprisingly assimilated with white American culture already. If you ever have the chance, I recommend that you visit the museum at New Echota in northern Georgia today. You can see reconstructed buildings on the original site of the Cherokee capital to give you an idea of what life was like for them. They lived in log cabins, much like the ones Andrew Jackson was used to. They farmed, much like their white neighbors. They were literate, bilingual as a matter of fact, speaking both Cherokee and English. They had their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, which was bilingual as well. Even their government resembled that of the United States. They had three branches of government: the executive, legislative, and judicial. You can visit their Supreme Court. You can visit their legislative building, which, by the way, had 2 stories, one for the upper house, one for the lower house. Does that sound familiar? The Cherokee government was supposed to represent the Cherokee people, but when the Treaty of New Echota was signed in 1835, it clearly was not speaking for the majority of the Cherokee people. The majority was very much opposed to signing a treaty agreeing to relocate to Oklahoma, but an influential minority of leaders agreed to sign this treaty, and the officials who were sent to negotiate the treaty were perfectly willing to accept it, even with the irregularities. How did the United States government respond to this fraudulent treaty? Andrew Jackson, as president, was fine with it. Remember, he was elected by the common man to act in their interests, and it was the common man of Georgia who was eager to see the Cherokee relocated so that they could then claim their valuable land. The state of Georgia, of course, was all for it. They were eager to accept the treaty. The Cherokee people, of course, had a different response, and the Supreme Court, interestingly, sided with the Cherokee. I'll not go into a lot of detail about specific cases where the Supreme Court sided with the Cherokee, but the Supreme Court was the one branch of government to stand up for the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation and the fact that they were entitled to a fair treaty. Well, Andrew Jackson basically didn't care what the Supreme Court had to say about it. He was ready to execute the terms of this treaty in spite of the fraud. Basically, this treaty made way for the common man. It's important to notice the link between democratization and the Trail of Tears. In 1838, the Trail of Tears took place. Some Cherokee had voluntarily left before this time, but many waited until they were forced by violence to move. Of the 16,000 Cherokee who were forced along the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma, about 4,000, or 1 in 4 of those, never made it to the other end. It was very brutal treatment, and before they even left the East, they were herded like cattle, stockaded, and held as prisoners until they were forced to move out. There was also the eastern band of Cherokee. Some of the Cherokee who lived on the eastern fringes of the Cherokee Nation in the Smoky Mountains were able to hide out in the mountains and escape the Trail of Tears. As you might imagine, many of them were killed for resisting in this way, but eventually the military just gave up and decided to leave the Cherokee who were left alone. That is why to this day you can visit the Smoky Mountains and see the presence of Cherokee remaining in the East. As you reflect on the essay question asking whether too much democracy can be dangerous, I'm not asking you to bash democracy. Okay, there are many wonderful things about democracy, but I do want you to consider the great responsibility we have as participants in a democracy. And I think the Trail of Tears is a great example of how that the majority can do the wrong thing. So, as a privileged participant in a democratic government, be responsible about how you use your political power, and always consider the rights of minorities.